The fever began like a whisper, a warmth so faint Seraphina Silvercrest mistook it for nerves, a flutter beneath her ribs, a softness spreading through her belly like candlelight through glass. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall of her chamber and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her father taught her when the world became too loud. But within an hour, the whisper became a roar. Heat pooled low in her core and radiated outward, licking along her spine, flooding her limbs with a heaviness that made standing feel like a negotiation with gravity. Her skin prickled beneath her ceremonial dress. Every thread of fabric felt like a language she no longer understood. Too rough, too close, too much. She knew what this was. Every Omega knew. The elders spoke of it in careful, measured tones during the education sessions. The biological awakening. The first heat. That threshold moment when an Omega's body declared itself ready for bonding, for claiming, for surrender. It was supposed to arrive within hours of her 18th birthday, a predictable, manageable window that could be planned for, prepared against. Seraphina would not turn 18 until midnight, 9 hours from now. Her fingers found the silver pendant at her throat. Her mother's. The chain was thin, almost fragile, but Seraphina had worn it every day since she was 13 years old. Since the night both her parents were killed in the final battles that brought the Trinity Kings to power. She had been a child standing in a field of ash, holding this necklace, understanding with terrible clarity that no one was coming to save her. No one ever had. She had saved herself. Saved her pack. 47 wolves who looked to a 13-year-old girl and found, against all reason, someone worth following. 7 years of border skirmishes and resource shortages and political maneuvering against packs 10 times their size. 7 years of sleeping with maps spread across her bed, of learning supply chain logistics the way other girls learned poetry, of treating every meal as a tactical decision because some months the math simply did not allow everyone to eat. And tonight was supposed to be the culmination of all of it. The allegiance ceremony. A 30-minute diplomatic formality at Obsidian Fortress where she would kneel before the Trinity Kings, swear loyalty, and secure the protection treaty that would finally give her people safety. Stable borders, medical supplies, food that did not require rationing. She could not cancel. The treaty required the ceremony to take place on her 18th birthday. Missing it would put Silvercrest Pack in breach. No protection, no resources, no safety net for 47 wolves who had already survived more than anyone should have to. Another wave of heat crashed through her body and she doubled over, gripping the edge of her dresser. The wood creaked under her fingers. In the mirror, she watched her own reflection with clinical detachment. Flushed cheeks, dilated pupils, a sheen of perspiration along her collarbone that caught the lamplight like morning dew on a blade. Her wolf, that quiet presence in the back of her consciousness, the one that usually listened to reason, had woken up howling. Seraphina reached for her phone. Her hands trembled so badly it took 3 attempts to type the message. Heat started early. Still going. She sent it to Brenna Stormvale. Best friend since childhood. Beta warrior. The only person in the world Seraphina trusted without calculation. Brenna was already at Obsidian Fortress with the advanced delegation handling preliminary protocol. The reply came in 11 seconds. Oh, okay. Then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Brenna to shift from shock to strategy, I will position myself near the exits. If things go sideways, we extract immediately. Trinity protection laws should cover you. They cannot proceed with mate assignment if you are in heat. Worst case, you do the oath and we get you out. The logic was sound. Seraphina clung to it the way a drowning woman clings to wreckage. The Trinity Kings had built their reputation partly on progressive Omega protection policies. Any bonding required clear, unambiguous consent from an Omega who was not biologically compromised. An Omega in heat could not provide that consent, so the worst case was humiliation. Walk in, scent gives her away, ceremony aborted, reschedule after her cycle. Embarrassing. Survivable. The alternative was unthinkable. She pulled on her traveling cloak with shaking hands, fastened the silver pendant tighter against her throat, and walked out of her chamber on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. The carriage ride became its own kind of war. Every rut in the road jolted through her hypersensitive body like electricity. The leather seat was too smooth. The air inside the cabin was too still, too saturated with her own scent, that unmistakable sweetness that announced vulnerability to every wolf within 100 yards. She pressed her knees together and bit down on the inside of her cheek, hard enough to taste copper. Think tactically. Her father's voice, as clear as the day he taught her to read topographic maps in the woods behind their den. When the situation is hostile, break it into components. What do you control? What can you influence? What must you accept? She controlled her words. She could influence perception. She had to accept that her body had declared war on her timeline. The fortress materialized through the carriage window like something from a cautionary tale. Obsidian Fortress, named for the black stone that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. It sat on high ground, walls thick enough to absorb artillery, sight lines that would make any assault a mathematical impossibility. Her father had taught her to evaluate military installations with a professional eye, and even through the fog of heat, her mind cataloged what she saw. Snipers on 3 rooftops. Quick reaction teams staged at every visible entrance. Guard rotations at intervals suggesting wartime protocols, not ceremonial security. Something was wrong. This level of military readiness did not match a routine allegiance ceremony. This was threat response posture. Someone or something had triggered preparations for genuine combat operations. The carriage stopped. A female beta she did not recognize opened the door. Professional demeanor. Carefully neutral expression. Miss Silvercrest, I am Linnea Frost. I will be escorting you to the throne room. The Trinity Kings are waiting. Seraphina stepped out on legs that no longer felt like her own. Linnea's hand caught her elbow, brief and professional, just enough to prevent a stumble that would have announced her condition to every guard in the courtyard. The other woman's eyes flickered with something that might have been concern, quickly masked. The walk through Obsidian Fortress felt like descending into the throat of something ancient and hungry. Corridors of black stone, torches casting shadows that danced like living things. The air was cool, but Seraphina burned. Each step a negotiation between the discipline her father had forged into her bones and the biology that was trying to unmake her from the inside out. Her fingers closed around the silver pendant. Hold on, just hold on. Linnea stopped before a pair of massive double doors, dark wood banded with iron. Behind them, silence so complete it had weight. We are here. Linnea's voice carried something that might have been genuine warning. I am required to announce you and then leave. After that, you will be alone with them. Are you certain you want to proceed? Seraphina met the woman's eyes. She thought of 47 wolves waiting for her to secure their future, of children in her pack who deserved to grow up without hunger, of her father teaching her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. I am certain the doors opened. The throne room swallowed her whole. Vaulted ceilings vanished into darkness far above. 3 thrones dominated a raised dais at the far end, positioned for complete tactical oversight of anyone who entered. And rising from those thrones were 3 men who made every instinct Seraphina possessed scream a single word: danger. The Thornfield brothers, Caspian, Lysander, Fenris. Identical triplets in that uncanny way where small differences dissolved at first glance. Tall, broad, moving with the kind of predatory grace that belonged to creatures who had never once known what it meant to be prey. But it was their eyes, silver, all 3 sets, fixed on her with an intensity that made the heat in her body surge so violently she swayed on her feet. And then the mate bond hit. Not 1 bond, 3. 3 threads of connection slammed into her chest like fists, wrapping around her heart, pulling tight, binding her to these strangers with a certainty that obliterated every tactical assessment she had ever made. Her wolf did not whisper this time. Her wolf sang, "Mate, mate, mate." The ancient clock tower beyond the walls began its midnight toll, 12 deep tones marking the exact moment Seraphina Silvercrest turned 18. The exact moment biology and destiny conspired to destroy every plan she had ever made. She stood in the heart of their power, burning with heat, shattered by bonds that should not exist, facing 3 kings who looked at her like they intended to keep her forever. And the only thought her crumbling mind could form was a single, desperate word: no. The word died on her lips before it could become anything more than breath. No. She had thought it, maybe whispered it. But the mate bond did not care about her objections. It pulsed through her chest like a second heartbeat, steady and absolute, and so fundamentally certain that fighting it felt like arguing with gravity. The one in the center spoke first. His voice was low and controlled, carrying the kind of authority that did not need volume because it had never once been questioned. "My name is Caspian Thornfield. These are my brothers, Lysander and Fenris. We are the Trinity Kings. And you, little Omega, have just presented yourself to us during your first heat, while 3 mate bonds declare you ours." He paused. "Let that settle. Do you understand what that means?" Seraphina tried to speak, tried to gather the discipline her father had spent years forging into her nervous system. But another wave of heat rolled through her body like a tide, and her legs simply stopped cooperating. She went down hard, knees cracking against cold stone, the impact jolting through her bones while her body trembled with need and fear and the overwhelming gravitational pull of 3 bonds trying to drag her toward the dais. The one on the left moved, not quickly, deliberately. The way a predator closes distance when it knows there is nowhere for the prey to run. It means you belong to us. His voice was rougher than Caspian's, blunter, a blade without a sheath. Your Omega nature recognizes us as your alphas. Your body is crying out for our touch. I am Fenris, by the way, the one who is going to enjoy watching you struggle with this. The 3rd brother descended from the dais with precision that made Seraphina's breath catch. He circled her slowly, staying just out of reach, and she could feel his gaze moving over her like something with texture and temperature. I am Lysander, His voice was softer than the others, warmer, carrying a gentleness that the other two lacked entirely. And I think our little mate is terrified. Look at her trembling, caught between heat and pride, trying to hold herself together when everything inside her is screaming for relief. He crouched to her level. Silver eyes met hers with an intensity that made rational thought feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. You can feel it, can you not? The bonds pulling you toward us. Your Omega instincts demanding surrender. The heat building until you think you will burn alive if someone does not touch you. Seraphina forced words past the desire that was trying to strangle her voice. Each syllable cost her something she was not sure she could spare. I came here to swear allegiance and return to my pack, not to be claimed by 3 kings who think they own me because of some biological accident. The temperature in the throne room dropped by 10 degrees. All 3 brothers went very still. The kind of stillness that preceded violence in every combat scenario her father had ever described. Then Caspian was moving, closing the distance between them so fast she registered only the displacement of air before his hand was in her hair, fist tight, pulling her head back to expose the full length of her throat. Biological accident. He repeated her words back to her, with a softness that was somehow more dangerous than shouting. Is that what you believe the mate bond is? A random misfire of chemistry? His grip adjusted, not painful, but absolutely, unmistakably in control. The goddess herself has declared that you were made for us, that your purpose is to stand beside us, to rule beside us. And you call it an accident. Tears burned behind her eyes. She refused to release them. 7 years of leadership had taught her that showing weakness was an invitation for exploitation, and she was kneeling on cold stone surrounded by 3 alphas who had just announced their intention to keep her forever. So she did what her father had trained her to do when the tactical situation appeared hopeless. She negotiated. I have a pack, 47 wolves who depend on my decisions, families who trust me, children who deserve safety. Her voice shook, but it did not break. If I am your mate, your queen, then I should have equal say in how this works. She saw it register in Caspian's eyes. The shift from predator assessing prey to strategist recognizing a worthy opponent. Here is my counteroffer. We complete the political ceremony I came here for. I return to my pack, and we take time to determine what these bonds actually mean before anyone makes permanent decisions. Silence. Then Lysander laughed. It was genuine, warm. The sound of a man encountering something delightful in a place where he expected nothing but compliance. She has fire, this one. I like it. Caspian's expression did not change, but his hand released her hair. He stepped back just enough to give her room to breathe. His strategic mind was visibly working behind those silver eyes, calculating variables the way she calculated supply routes. Your counteroffer is rejected. You are not leaving this fortress while in heat. It is not safe for you, and it is not safe for every unmated male who would catch your scent between here and your territory. Fenris spoke from the dais, his tone carrying the flat effect of a man delivering tactical assessment rather than personal opinion. Our laws protect Omegas, but biology does not read legislation. You stay here, where you are protected. And as for time, Lysander added, rising from his crouch with fluid grace, you can have all the time you need after we help you through your heat. Because allowing you to suffer through it alone when we could ease it would be cruelty. And whatever you might believe about us, we are not cruel to what is ours. Seraphina's mind raced even as her body screamed. They had rejected her first offer. Standard negotiation. You never accept the opening terms. Her father's voice in her memory, steady and methodical. You counter. You find the middle ground. You secure what matters most and concede what matters least. What mattered most was autonomy after the heat. What mattered least was the heat itself, because that was happening regardless. Then, let me propose different terms. Her voice steadied. She was on familiar ground now. Negotiation was territory she understood. You help me through the heat. I accept that. But no claiming bites. Those marks are permanent, and I will not wear them until I have had time to evaluate this with a clear mind. After the heat passes, we negotiate as equals. My pack, my independence, my role, everything. She held Caspian's gaze with everything she had left. And during the heat, you ask before you act. Every time. I may be in heat, but I am still a person with a voice, and you will hear it. The silent communication between the three brothers lasted perhaps 4 seconds. She watched it happen. The micro expressions, the slight shifts in posture, the way their eyes moved in patterns that spoke to years of nonverbal coordination. They were not just brothers. They were a unit. A single strategic mind operating through 3 bodies. Caspian spoke for all of them. Agreed. No claiming bites. No permanent bonds beyond what the goddess has already forged. After the heat, we talk. We negotiate. We determine how this works. His jaw tightened. But during your heat, Seraphina, you stop fighting what your body needs. You let us help you. You accept relief instead of suffering for pride. He paused. Your choice. 2 words. 2 simple words that rearranged something fundamental inside her chest. He was giving her agency. In a situation where biology and power dynamics and every tradition in their world said she had none, this Alpha King was standing in front of her and saying, "Choose." "Deal," she whispered. Lysander lifted her before she fully registered his arms, sliding beneath her knees and around her shoulders. Her body, traitor that it was, melted into the contact instantly. His scent wrapped around her like a blanket woven from pine needles and winter air, and something beneath both that she had no name for, but that her wolf recognized as home. The desperate ache in her core eased just barely enough for coherent thought to resurface. The shift from throne room to private chambers felt like crossing between worlds. Cold black stone gave way to warmth. Firelight replaced torchlight. And the bedroom dominated the space with a bed so vast it could only have been built for 3 large men who slept as a unit. Seraphina stared at it, and reality crashed over her like cold water. She was going to be intimate with 3 men, 3 alphas, 3 kings, during her first heat, when she had never in her life been kissed. The panic must have shown on her face, because Lysander set her down gently on the edge of the bed and knelt before her. His silver eyes held concern, not hunger, not possession, genuine worry for the woman trembling in front of him. Breathe. His voice was soft, but it carried command the way good leadership always does, through calm rather than volume. We are not going to hurt you. We are not going to take more than you can give. You say, stop. We stop. You say slow. We slow down. Your comfort matters more than our instincts. His hand lifted toward her face. Hovered. May I? 2 words again. Different man. Same principle. The asking, the waiting. The refusal to take what could be given. Yes. His fingers brushed her cheek, and the heat responded like a flame introduced to oxygen. She gasped. His thumb traced her lower lip, with a tenderness that made her eyes sting for reasons that had nothing to do with pain. "May I kiss you?" She looked at this man who could have taken anything he wanted and was choosing instead to kneel at her feet and ask permission. Something cracked open inside her chest, not breaking, blooming. Yes. His mouth met hers gently. Just a soft press of lips that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that kissing was not what she had imagined. It was better. Infinitely, terrifyingly better. He deepened the kiss slowly, giving her time to adjust, his tongue finding hers in a rhythm that sent heat cascading through her belly and pulled a sound from her throat she did not recognize as her own. When he pulled back, her lips were swollen and her breathing was ragged and her entire body was vibrating with a frequency that felt like it might shake her apart. "My turn." Fenris did not ask. He announced, but he waited 3 full seconds after the announcement, watching her face, giving her space to refuse. When she did not, he kissed her with a roughness that was everything Lysander had not been. His teeth caught her lower lip. His hand fisted in her hair. He kissed the way he spoke, direct and unapologetic, and something in Seraphina's body responded to the contrast with a desperation that frightened her. Then Caspian was turning her face toward him. His eyes were dark with desire, but still maintaining that edge of control that marked him as the strategist, the planner, the man who calculated outcomes even while his blood was burning. "And I make 3, he murmured. His kiss was both gentle and possessive at once. He kissed the way he led, with absolute authority that somehow left room for her to meet him as an equal. His hand cradled the back of her neck, and she felt the silver pendant press between their bodies, warm from her skin. When all 3 had kissed her, Seraphina was trembling so violently she could not have stood if her life depended on it. The heat had become a living thing inside her, demanding and desperate, and so far beyond her ability to manage that pride, felt like a concept from another lifetime. Caspian stood. His hands moved to the collar of his formal jacket with methodical precision. "We are going to undress you now. Lysander and Fenris will help you with your dress while I prepare the bed. If anything makes you uncomfortable, you tell us immediately." She could only nod. Their hands found the laces of her dress and worked with an efficiency that spoke to coordination in all things. The fabric slid from her shoulders and pooled at her waist, and the cool air against her flushed skin made her shiver. Within moments, she wore only thin undergarments and vulnerability. The way all 3 of them looked at her made her feel more exposed than bare skin ever could. Beautiful. Lysander breathed the word like a prayer. "Look at you." Fenris settled his hand on her knee. His palm was rough with calluses and warm enough to brand. So responsive. "I can smell how much you need this." "Are you aching, Seraphina?" Yes. The admission cost her nothing because it was so obviously true there was no point pretending. "It hurts. Please, I need—" She did not know how to finish that sentence, but they did. Caspian's voice again, steady and sure. "Lie back. Let us see you." She let them arrange her in the center of that enormous bed. Let them remove the last barriers of fabric until there was nothing left between her body and the air and their silver eyes. The heat had burned away embarrassment. What remained was need, pure and consuming and beyond any tactical framework she possessed. What followed was slow, deliberate, orchestrated with the same precision they brought to everything. Caspian's hands mapped the geography of her body with strategic patience. Every touch asked a question and waited for her answer. Lysander's mouth followed, warm and reverent, learning what made her gasp and cataloging it for future reference. And Fenris. Fenris watched, read every response. And when he finally put his mouth on her where the ache was worst, his skill was so devastating that Seraphina's first climax tore through her with an intensity that erased thought entirely. The heat eased, slightly, temporarily. They built her up again. Patient, thorough, until she was beyond words, beyond strategy, beyond anything except the knowledge that she needed to be filled completely, or she would shatter. Caspian positioned himself above her. This will hurt initially. Your heat will help, but this is your first time. If it becomes too much, tell me. She nodded. He pressed forward, slowly, giving her body time to accommodate the intrusion. It burned, walking the razor edge between pain and pleasure. His forehead touched hers. Breathe. Let your body adjust. You are doing so well. The praise made something clench deep inside her. He groaned, then began to move, slow and deep, and Seraphina discovered that everything she thought she knew about her own body had been a rough draft. The others were beside her through all of it, hands in her hair, mouths on her skin, murmured words she could not quite parse, but that her wolf understood perfectly. When she broke apart again, it was with Caspian locked inside her, and Lysander holding her hand, and Fenris pressing his lips to her temple with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his sharp-edged exterior. They took turns through the night, each one different, each claiming something distinct. Caspian was control and depth. Lysander was warmth and patience. Fenris was intensity and fire. And somewhere between them, in the spaces where tenderness replaced urgency and soft words replaced commanding ones, Seraphina stopped cataloging and simply existed. When it was finally over, when the heat had receded enough for exhaustion to claim her, she lay between three bodies that radiated warmth like furnaces. Lysander's arm across her waist. Fenris pressed against her back, his breathing already slow with sleep. Caspian beside her, still awake, watching her face with an expression she could not read. She felt him pull the blanket higher over her shoulder, felt his fingers brush the silver pendant that still hung at her throat. "Sleep," he said quietly. "We will figure out the rest tomorrow." She wanted to argue, wanted to reassert terms and boundaries and the independence she had spent 7 years building, but her body was wrung out and warm and safe in a way that felt biological and ancient and terrifyingly correct. Seraphina closed her eyes, and the last thing she registered before consciousness dissolved was the steady beating of 3 hearts surrounding her, synchronized and certain, as though they had always been waiting for exactly this. Dawn came like an interrogation, gray light through narrow windows, cold air finding gaps in the blankets, and clarity. Brutal, unwelcome clarity flooding back into a mind that had spent the night surrendered to instinct. Seraphina opened her eyes. 3 men. 3 massive, sleeping, unfamiliar men wrapped around her like she was the center of their orbit. The soreness between her thighs confirmed everything. The tenderness at her throat where mouths had lingered confirmed more. Her breathing accelerated. Her hands began to shake. "I need to go home." The words left her mouth before she could evaluate whether saying them was strategically sound. "My pack. They expected me hours ago. Brenna will think something terrible happened." Lysander stirred, his arm tightening around her waist. "Easy. I can feel your anxiety through the bond. Whatever you are processing, we can work through it together." But Seraphina was already sitting up, already reaching for the sheet to wrap around herself like armor, already rebuilding the walls that the night had dissolved. Because in the harsh light of morning, with her mind finally clear and her body finally quiet, she understood exactly what had happened, and it terrified her far more than the heat ever had. Something terrible did happen, Fenris said without opening his eyes. His voice carried the gravel of interrupted sleep and something that sounded dangerously close to amusement. You met your mates and spent the night being thoroughly worshipped. Absolutely catastrophic. The casual dismissal lit a fuse inside her chest. This is not funny. Seraphina pulled the sheet tighter. I have responsibilities. 47 wolves who are waiting to hear whether their alpha secured the protection treaty or disappeared into a fortress and never came back. My people are probably terrified right now. Your pack is fine. Caspian had not moved from his position, but his eyes were open and alert in a way that suggested he had been awake for some time, possibly the entire night. We sent word that you were remaining as our honored guest. They will assume you are negotiating expanded treaty terms. He sat up slowly. The sheet fell to his waist, and Seraphina forced herself not to look at the landscape of muscle and old scars that the motion revealed. What they do not know, he continued, his tone shifting from reassurance to something harder, something that carried the weight of a decision already made, is that you are now mated to 3 kings. And that changes everything. I am not mated. Seraphina's voice found its steel. We agreed. No claiming bites, no permanent bonds. Last night was survival, not commitment. Fenris finally opened his eyes. Silver. Unreadable. You can call it whatever helps you sleep. But those bonds are real. They do not require bites to exist. The goddess forged them, and no amount of tactical reframing changes that. Seraphina stood, the sheet wrapped around her like makeshift armor, trailing across the stone floor as she put distance between herself and the bed. Between herself and the 3 men who had spent the night dismantling every wall she had built over 7 years of solitary leadership. Then we negotiate. Her chin lifted. That was the agreement. Heat passes, we talk as equals. She watched the silent communication pass between them. Those micro shifts in posture, the fractional movements of brows and jaws that constituted an entire language. 3 men who had operated as a single tactical unit through 2 decades of military service and 5 years of ruling the most volatile werewolf territory in North America. Caspian spoke for all of them. What do you want? 6 conditions. Seraphina had spent the final moments before sleep organizing her demands. Even exhausted, even shattered, her mind worked the way her father had trained it to work. Tactically. First, weekly visits to Silvercrest Pack. Not monthly. Weekly. My wolves need to see their alpha regularly or the pack bond deteriorates. Agreed. Caspian's response was immediate, with appropriate security escort. Second, real authority, not ceremonial duties. If I am your partner, I want genuine power, access to intelligence networks, participation in all council sessions, the ability to propose and implement policy changes. Done, Lysander said. He had risen from the bed and was pulling on loose clothing with the unhurried ease of a man who had no reason to rush because the world waited for him, not the other way around. Your perspective from leading a small pack will be valuable. We have blind spots you can see. Third, Seraphina kept her voice level, even as the magnitude of what she was negotiating pressed against her ribs. 6 weeks minimum before any discussion of claiming bites. I need time with clear judgment to evaluate whether these bonds are something I choose or something biology is forcing on me. 6 weeks, Caspian repeated. You will live here. Work with us. See what this partnership looks like from the inside. At the end, if you genuinely want to walk away, we discuss options. 4th, my best friend Brenna Stormvale serves as my personal guard. Not your guards. Mine. Fenris raised an eyebrow. That was the closest thing to an emotional response she had seen from him outside of combat readiness. She is a beta warrior. Not exactly our tier of security personnel. She is the only person in the world I trust completely. Seraphina held his gaze. That is worth more than any tier of combat training. A beat of silence. Then Fenris nodded once, conceding the point with a brevity that she was beginning to understand was his version of respect. 5th, veto power in council. Not unlimited, but enough that I cannot be overruled on matters directly affecting Omega welfare or small pack resource allocation. Caspian studied her with an expression that had shifted from reluctant negotiator to something closer to admiration. Granted. Subject to Trinity override in matters of territorial security. 6th, Seraphina took a breath. When I address the court today, I speak for myself. No scripted remarks. No handlers. I stand before your people on my own terms, or I do not stand before them at all. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Seraphina to hear her own heartbeat. Then Lysander smiled. Not the charming grin he deployed like a weapon, but something quieter, something real. You have yourself a deal, Seraphina Silvercrest. The formal announcement took place 3 hours later in a throne room packed with over 1,000 wolves. Seraphina stood between the Thornfield brothers wearing borrowed silver and white, her hair still damp from bathing. The marks on her throat hidden beneath a high collar because those were not anyone's business, but hers. She could feel every eye in the room cataloging her, measuring, judging. Caspian's voice carried with the authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. Last night, the mate bonds formed between myself, my brothers, and Seraphina Silvercrest. The moon goddess has chosen her as our mate, our equal, our Luna. The word hit the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of shock, disbelief, hostility, and something that might have been awe spread outward from the dais. An older alpha stepped forward from the front row, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing his status like a second skin. The Silvercrest pack brings no significant alliance, no military strength, no political leverage. What justifies elevating a border pack daughter to queen? Before any of the kings could respond, Seraphina stepped forward. You want to question divine selection? Question me instead. Her voice carried through the space with a clarity that surprised even her. 7 years of giving orders to wolves twice her age had taught her that authority lived in the voice before it lived anywhere else. I came here expecting a simple ceremony. Instead, I found 3 mate bonds that should not exist. Yes, I was in heat, but these 3 men gave me choices at every step, negotiated terms, prioritized my consent over biology. She paused. Let her eyes move across the crowd. Let them see that she was looking at them, not hiding from them. You think this is about resources? I am a Force Recon veteran's daughter. I have led my pack since I was 13 years old. I do not need 3 kings to give me power. I already have it. What the mate bond gives me is allies, partners. And what it gives this territory is a queen who understands the small packs, who knows what it means to fight for survival with nothing but strategy and stubbornness, who will not make decisions from privilege because she has never had any. The response was fractured. Some faces held skepticism, others carried open hostility. But in pockets throughout the crowd, Seraphina saw something else. Nods, slight ones, barely perceptible, from wolves who recognized the truth in her words because they had lived it themselves. Then an elderly woman moved forward from the assembly. White hair, weathered features sharpened by decades of observation, eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I am Elder Isolde Greymore of the Clearwater Pack. My grandmother was the last Omega to bear 3 mates, 80 years ago, before such bonds were forbidden. The murmur that went through the crowd carried the weight of history being invoked. The old council banned triple bonds, not because they were unnatural, Isolde continued, her voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision, but because they were too powerful. An Omega bonded to 3 alphas could not be controlled, could not be diminished, could not be made to disappear quietly when her existence became inconvenient. She turned her gaze to Seraphina. You are not an anomaly, child. You are a weapon the goddess has forged for battles that have not yet begun. I suggest this court recognize that rather than question divine wisdom. The elder's words settled over the assembly like a verdict. Not everyone accepted it, but the weight of historical authority made dismissal significantly harder. Then he appeared, a distinguished man in his 50s moving through the crowd with the kind of practiced ease that suggested he had spent years learning exactly how to be noticed without appearing to seek attention. Something about him made the tactical centers of Seraphina's brain fire warning signals before she could articulate why. Caspian's voice dropped to a register meant only for her ears. Mordecai Ashbourne, old council member. He barely escaped execution 5 years ago. He has been running operations against us ever since. Patient, methodical, extremely dangerous. Mordecai bowed with flawless formality. Your Majesties. Miss Silvercrest, I wish only to express congratulations on this unprecedented development. 3 mates. The goddess certainly works in mysterious ways. He paused with the precision of a man who understood exactly how to make silence feel like a weapon. I do hope the young lady is prepared for the scrutiny this will bring. Not everyone will be as gracious as Elder Isolde. His eyes found Seraphina's, held them. And in that fraction of a second she saw something that her father had taught her to recognize in enemy combatants. Assessment. He was not threatening her. He was measuring her. Your concern is noted and rejected, Caspian said. Anyone with objections can bring them to us directly. Mordecai bowed again and withdrew, but Seraphina watched him move through the crowd and cataloged the wolves who made eye contact with him as he passed. 4. She counted 4 separate exchanges of glances that lasted a beat too long to be casual acknowledgement. She filed that information away and said nothing. The days that followed reshaped Seraphina's understanding of what partnership could look like. She had expected to be decorative, a political ornament installed in comfortable quarters while the real work happened behind closed doors. Instead, Caspian assigned her a seat in the war room on her second morning and handed her intelligence briefings with the same expression he wore when distributing operational assignments to his brothers. The Northern Territories encompassed 47 packs across 6 states. The complexity of managing that network required constant vigilance, and Seraphina absorbed it with the same focused intensity she had once applied to keeping her own small pack alive through winters that should have killed them. It was during the 3rd evening that the first wall came down. Seraphina found Caspian alone in the war room at 3 a.m. The tactical displays cast blue light across his face and turned the silver in his eyes into something electric. He was running combat simulations, not current scenarios, historical ones. The same engagement, over and over, with slight variations in the variables. She recognized the date, 5 years ago, the night of the coup. "How many?" she asked quietly. He did not look up. 14. In 6 hours. I authorized every strike, planned the timing, chose the targets. He paused. Some of them were not combatants. They were council staff, administrative personnel who happened to be in the wrong building at the wrong time because I calculated that warning them would compromise operational security. His hands were perfectly still on the display controls, but she could see the tension in his forearms, the way his jaw was set against something that went far deeper than tactical analysis. "I remember every face," he said. "I see them when I close my eyes. 5 years, and I still cannot determine whether what we did was necessary evil or simply evil that produced necessary results." Seraphina sat beside him, not touching, just present. The way she had learned to be present for wolves in her pack who carried grief too heavy for words, but too important for silence. "My father killed people," she said. "Force recon. He never told me how many. But some nights I would find him sitting on the porch, staring at nothing, and I would sit with him. He never explained, and I never asked. I just stayed." For the first time since she had known him, Caspian looked at her without calculation, without strategy. Just a man carrying weight he had never set down, looking at a woman who understood what that weight felt like. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. He simply returned to his simulations, and she stayed beside him until dawn turned the war room windows gray. The second wall fell 2 nights later. Seraphina was pulled from sleep by a sound that made her blood go cold. Fenris thrashing in the sheets beside her, producing a noise from somewhere deep in his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a scream. His body was rigid with combat tension, muscles locked in patterns designed for violence, and his eyes were open but seeing something that existed only in the landscape of memory. Lysander was already awake, watching with the careful stillness of someone who had witnessed this before and knew better than to intervene physically. "Do not grab him," Lysander murmured. "Touch his hand. Speak softly. Ground him." Seraphina reached for Fenris's clenched fist, laid her fingers against his knuckles. His skin was burning. "Fenris." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You are in Obsidian Fortress. You are safe. I am here." His breathing was ragged, desperate, the breathing of a man running from something that could not be outrun because it lived inside him. She kept talking, kept her hand against his, patient and steady and refusing to leave. When his eyes finally focused, when the present replaced whatever past had been consuming him, he looked at her with an expression so raw it made her chest ache. "Afghanistan," he said. The word came out broken. A convoy, an ambush. I made a call. Put my team on a road that intelligence said was clear. It was not clear. He swallowed. 3 men. My men. Following my orders. Dead because I trusted a report I should have verified. His hand unclenched beneath her fingers, turned over, found hers, held on. "Do not go." 2 words. She had heard Fenris deliver threat assessments with less emotion than he put into those 2 syllables. This was not the dangerous alpha who sharpened knives like meditation. This was a man who had learned to build walls out of combat readiness because the alternative was feeling everything he had survived. She stayed. She held his hand through the slow unwinding of adrenaline, through the silence that followed confession, through the gradual return of steady breathing. And she said nothing, because some wounds did not need analysis. They needed witness. The third wall fell quietly, without drama, in the intelligence room on a Tuesday afternoon. Lysander was reviewing intercepted communications, standard practice, routine work. But when Seraphina entered, she found him sitting motionless, a single document displayed on his screen, his hands flat on the desk in the posture of a man trying to hold himself together through physical contact with something solid. She read over his shoulder. It was a message from a 15-year-old Omega in a Southern Territory pack. Intercepted, decoded, filed as intelligence. The girl was describing in careful, understated language the mating arrangement her alpha father had negotiated on her behalf. The male was 43. The girl had not been asked. The bonding was scheduled for the following week. "This is why," Lysander said without looking up. "This is why we built the protection laws, not politics, not power. This, a child writing a letter she thinks no one will ever read, describing the end of her life in a tone so calm it means she has already accepted that no one is coming to help." His voice did not waver, but his hands pressed harder against the desk. "I read these every day, hundreds, thousands over 5 years. Every intercepted message, every intelligence report, every piece of evidence that the old systems are still functioning in pockets where our reforms have not yet reached." He paused. "Caspian says, I take it too personally, that intelligence work requires emotional distance. Maybe he is right. But every time I read one of these, I think about the ones we have not intercepted yet. The ones being written right now by children who believe this is simply how the world works." Seraphina pulled a chair beside him. "What happened to this girl?" Lysander's jaw tightened. "Extraction team deployed 6 hours after interception. She is in a safe house now. The mating was prevented, but there are hundreds more, Seraphina. Hundreds we know about. Thousands we do not." She understood then why Lysander was the one who had pushed hardest for Omega protections, why his gentleness was not softness, but the deliberate choice of a man who saw cruelty in high definition every day and chose tenderness as an act of defiance against it. She took his hand, not as a mate, as a partner who understood that some battles were fought not with knives or strategies, but with the refusal to stop caring about individual suffering. "Show me," she said. "Show me all of it. If I am going to have authority here, I need to understand exactly what we are fighting for." He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on any of their faces before. Not desire, not assessment, not even affection. Hope. 3 nights of broken walls. 3 men who ruled 47 packs and commanded military forces spanning half a continent, revealing the fractures they had hidden from every living soul, and showing them to her. Because the mate bond made deception impossible, yes, but also because somewhere beneath the tactical calculations and predatory instincts, 3 Alpha Kings had recognized something in Seraphina Silvercrest that they had been searching for without knowing it. Not just a mate, a witness. Someone strong enough to see them clearly and brave enough to stay. The external threat announced itself without subtlety on the morning of her 12th day at Obsidian Fortress. Lysander burst into the breakfast room with a tablet displaying decoded transmissions, his usual composure fractured by urgency. 7 shell companies, 15 financial transactions in the past month, all routed through cutouts designed to be untraceable, but our analysts found the pattern. He laid the tablet on the table. Mordecai Ashbourne's financial network, mapped in precise detail. "He is funding something significant," Lysander continued. "And 3 hours ago, We intercepted a secondary communication, a reference to a target. Her eyes met Seraphina's across the table, and the gravity in them was absolute. The target is you. Fenris was already on his feet. His knife appeared in his hand with the unconscious speed of a reflex trained over 20 years. What else? There is more, Lysander said. Seraphina's food. The irregularity the kitchen staff flagged 2 days ago. We completed the analysis. A compound. Not lethal at the detected concentration. Barely enough to register. But present. Seraphina's blood went cold. He was not trying to poison me, she said slowly, her tactical mind engaging even as fear tried to claim her attention. That concentration would not cause harm. He was testing, probing whether our food security protocols would catch it, measuring response time. She looked at Caspian. He is mapping our defenses. The same way you map enemy positions before an assault. Every probe, every small test, gives him data about how we react, where we are strong, where the gaps are. Caspian studied the intelligence display with an expression she had learned to recognize over 12 days. It was the face he wore when comfortable certainties dissolved, and the picture that remained was worse than the one before. Seraphina, he said carefully, look at this. He spread the tactical map wider. 17 operations we have disrupted over 5 years. Every analyst, every strategist, every intelligence officer who has reviewed this record or reached the same conclusion. Mordecai Ashbourne is a persistent but ultimately unsuccessful insurgent running failed operations against a superior force. He paused. But you are looking at this differently. I can see it on your face. Tell me what you see. Seraphina moved to the display. Her fingers traced the timeline of disrupted operations, one after another. 5 years, 17 attempts. Each one intercepted, each one prevented, each one filed as evidence of the Trinity's superior intelligence capability. He is not failing, she said. The words landed in the room like a detonation. He is learning. Each operation is designed to test a specific aspect of your response capability. The first 3 tested your communication intercept speed. Operations 4 through 7 probed physical security at different facilities. 8 through 12 measured your financial tracking capability. 13 through 17 evaluated your response to different attack vectors. She turned to face 3 kings who were looking at her as though she had just redrawn the entire map. He has spent 5 years building a comprehensive profile of every defensive system you have. He knows your intercept timelines. He knows your security rotation patterns. He knows how fast your financial analysts can trace money. He knows your response protocols for every category of threat. Seraphina met Caspian's eyes. And his final examination is me, the new variable, the one element in your system that he has not yet profiled. He needs to know how I change your responses, whether I make you stronger or create new vulnerabilities. The silence in the room had the quality of air before a thunderstorm. Fenris spoke first. His voice carried no amusement now, no roughness. Just the flat, professional tone of a man who had survived enough combat to know when the situation had fundamentally changed. She is right. He looked at his brothers. 5 years, and none of us saw it. We have been filing victories while he has been building a playbook. Caspian had gone very still. The kind of stillness Seraphina recognized from her father. The stillness of a commander recalculating every assumption he had ever made. Then we stopped playing defense, he said quietly. Seraphina nodded. She could feel the mate bond humming between all 4 of them. Not desire this time. Something harder, sharper. The alignment of 4 tactical minds converging on the same conclusion. The war had already begun. They were only just now realizing it. The second heat arrived on the 19th day. Not the catastrophic wildfire of the first. This was different. A slow tide rising through her body across hours rather than minutes. A warmth that began in her chest and spread outward with almost deliberate patience, as though her biology had learned from the first time and decided that subtlety would be more effective than ambush. Seraphina recognized it at 6 a.m. during an intelligence briefing with Lysander. She was reading a decoded transmission when the words on the screen blurred and her skin flushed, and her wolf stirred from the quiet place she usually occupied and began to pace with an urgency that was impossible to misinterpret. She set the tablet down carefully. "It is starting again," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. 19 days of living with 3 Alpha Kings had not made her less controlled. It had given her control new foundations. Lysander looked up. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, catching the first traces of her scent shifting. His eyes darkened, silver bleeding toward something molten, but his voice remained measured. "How are you feeling?" "Present," she said. "Clear. This is not like last time. I can think." He studied her face with the attention of a man whose entire career had been built on reading what people did not say. "Good. Because I want to ask you something, and I need to know the answer comes from you, not from your biology." Seraphina waited. These 19 days. Lysander set his own tablet aside and gave her his full attention. "You have seen us work, seen us fail, seen Caspian at 3 a.m. running simulations of the people he killed, seen Fenris screaming in his sleep, seen me unable to put down intelligence reports about children who need help I cannot provide fast enough." He paused. "Have we earned your trust? Not your obligation, not your biological compliance, your trust." The heat pulsed gently through her core, but it did not answer for her. That was the difference. The first heat had been a siege. This was a question, and her mind was clear enough to respond with honesty rather than desperation. She thought about Caspian sitting beside her in the war room at 3 a.m, showing her the faces he could not forget. About Fenris holding her hand in the dark and saying 2 words that cost him more than any combat operation. About Lysander reading a child's letter with his palms flat on the desk because holding himself together was the only alternative to breaking apart. 3 men who could take anything they wanted from the world and instead had chosen to show her the places where they were broken. "Yes," she said, "you have earned my trust." Something shifted in Lysander's expression. The intelligence officer receded. What remained was simply a man hearing the words he had been afraid to hope for. "Then come with me," he said, "and let us find our brothers." She found Caspian in the war room and Fenris in the training yard. They scented her the moment she entered their spaces. She watched the change move through their bodies like voltage, the pupils dilating, the posture shifting, the predatory stillness settling over them like armor. But neither moved toward her, neither reached. They waited. Seraphina had spent her entire life being underestimated. Too young, too small, too Omega. Every arena she entered had been one where the rules were written to ensure she lost. She had survived by learning those rules better than anyone and finding the spaces between them where victory was still possible. But standing in the corridor between the war room and the training yard with 3 Alpha Kings waiting for her to decide what happened next, she realized that for the first time in her life, the rules were hers to write. So she wrote them. She went to Fenris first. He was standing by the weapons rack, his knife in his hand, the whetstone forgotten on the bench behind him. Sweat from training still glistened on his forearms. His eyes tracked her approach with the focus of a man who had spent 20 years learning to read threat vectors, now applying that same attention to something far more dangerous than combat. Seraphina took the knife from his hand, set it on the bench, placed her palm flat against his chest where his heart was hammering beneath a layer of muscle and scar tissue and years of refusing to feel anything that could not be strategically justified. "I am choosing this," she said. "Not the heat, not the bond. Me." His hands hung at his sides. She could see the effort it cost him not to grab her. The restraint was visible in the tension of his fingers, the set of his jaw, the barely controlled movement of his breathing. "You are sure," he said. It was not a question. It was a confirmation. A man who needed to hear the words out loud because he had spent too many years trusting assessments that turned out to be wrong. "I am sure." She kissed him. Not the other way around. She rose on her toes, fisted her hand in the front of his training shirt, and pulled him down to her mouth. The sound he made against her lips was something between a groan and a surrender, and his hands finally moved, settling on her waist with a grip that communicated everything his sparse vocabulary could not. When she pulled back, his eyes were different. Not the flat tactical assessment she had grown accustomed to. Something raw, something young, something she suspected no living person had seen in Fenris Thornfield in a very long time. She went to Lysander next, found him in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her with a smile that was trying very hard to be casual and failing beautifully. "You kissed him first," he said. There was no jealousy in it, only warmth and something that sounded like being impressed. "He needed it most," Seraphina said simply. Lysander's smile deepened. "And what do I need?" She stepped into his space, placed both hands on his face, studied the silver eyes that spent every day cataloging suffering and chose gentleness anyway. "You need someone to see you. Not the intelligence officer, not the conscience of the Trinity, just you." She kissed him slowly, deliberately, with the kind of attention that said, "I am paying attention to every part of this." His hands came up to cover hers against his face, and she felt his fingers trembling. This man who processed thousands of intelligence reports without flinching, trembling because a woman was kissing him like he mattered. Caspian was last. She found him exactly where she expected to find him, in the war room, standing before the tactical display with his hands clasped behind his back, radiating the controlled stillness of a man who was using every ounce of discipline he possessed to remain where he was instead of coming to find her. She crossed the room, stood in front of the display so that he had no choice but to look at her instead of the map. "You are blocking my strategic overview," he said. His voice was level, but his eyes were not. "Yes, I am." She held his gaze. "Your turn." He studied her the way he studied battlefields, completely, thoroughly, looking for variables and contingencies and outcomes. But what he found was simpler than any strategic calculation. He found certainty. His hand lifted to her face, cupped her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that contradicted every hard edge of his reputation. "You have no idea what you do to me," he said quietly. "Every tactical instinct I possess tells me to calculate the implications of this moment, and I cannot. You have broken my ability to strategize, and I am not certain whether to thank you or declare it an act of war." She smiled. "Try both." He kissed her with the same precision he applied to everything, but beneath the control was hunger, raw and real and so tightly leashed that feeling it slip was like watching a dam develop fractures. When they were all together in the chambers, the heat had risen to a steady pulse that Seraphina could feel in her temples and her fingertips and the hollow of her throat, where the silver pendant lay warm against her skin. But her mind remained present, choosing. "I want to talk about the claiming bites," she said. The room went very still. 6 weeks was the agreement, Caspian said carefully. "It has been 19 days. "I know." Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed, looked at each of them in turn. "I know the timeline. And I know what I said. 6 weeks to evaluate. 6 weeks to determine whether these bonds were real or just biology performing its function." She took a breath. "But I have already seen what I needed to see. Not in the intimate moments, though those were revealing. In the other hours. The ones where you showed me who you are when you think no one important is watching." Her fingers found the pendant at her throat. "Caspian, I watched you sit with the ghosts of 14 people you killed because you believed it was necessary. You did not justify it. You did not rationalize. You sat with the weight of it because you believe a leader should carry the cost of every decision. That is who you are." She turned to the next brother. "Fenris, you have nightmares that turn you into a weapon before your conscious mind engages. You could hide that. You could sleep in separate quarters. Instead, you stayed. And when the dreams came, you let me hold your hand. That is who you are." Her gaze found the third. "Lysander, you read letters from children who are being destroyed by systems that are supposed to protect them. And instead of developing the emotional distance that would make your job bearable, you choose to feel every single one. Because you believe that the moment you stop feeling it is the moment you stop fighting to fix it. That is who you are." Seraphina stood. "I am not accepting these bonds because biology demands it. I am accepting them because I have spent 19 days watching 3 men who could rule through fear choose to rule through responsibility. I have seen your worst nights and your hardest truths, and I have not once wanted to leave." She met Caspian's eyes. "I am ready. Not because 6 weeks is approaching, because I have been sure since I sat with you at 3 in the morning and you did not pretend the ghosts were not there." The silence lasted 4 heartbeats. She counted them through the bond. Then Caspian crossed the room and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, not her mouth. Her forehead. The gesture of a man who wanted her to know that what came next was about more than desire. "We do this together," he said. "All 4. Every mark given and received." They undressed her slowly, reverently, as though the act of removing each layer was itself a ceremony. And when she stood bare before them, she did not feel vulnerable. She felt seen, completely, impossibly, finally seen. Caspian moved to her right side. His mouth found the place where her neck met her shoulder. His breath was warm against her skin. "This is permanent," he said. "Irreversible. Once I bite, you are mine in a way that transcends law and politics and even death. Tell me you understand." "I understand." His teeth broke her skin, and the world detonated. The bond with Caspian flooded through her like an anchor dropping into deep water. Grounding, stabilizing. She felt his mind touch hers and understood with sudden, devastating clarity the full scope of what he carried. Not just 14 ghosts, thousands of decisions, each one weighed against lives that depended on him getting it right. The loneliness of command so profound it had calcified around his heart like armor. And now there was her. A window in that armor, light where there had been only strategic darkness. She gasped. He held her through it. Lysander was next, left side. His approach was gentler, his mouth pressing soft kisses along her throat before finding the exact spot where the bond demanded completion. "Ready?" he whispered. "Yes." His bite was precise, and the bond that followed was warmth. Pure, flooding, incandescent warmth that poured through her chest and dissolved something she had not realized she was still holding on to. The belief that she was fundamentally alone. That survival required solitude. That needing people was a vulnerability she could not afford. Through Lysander's bond, she felt the truth. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. Fenris was last. He moved behind her, his chest against her back, his hands settling on her hips with a possessiveness that should have felt like confinement, but instead felt like safety. He did not ask if she was ready. He knew through the bond that she was. His teeth found the junction of neck and shoulder, and he bit with a dominance that sent electricity through her entire body. The bond with Fenris was fire, raw, protective, consuming fire. She felt his nightmares and his discipline and the relentless vigilance that never shut down because the one time he let his guard down, 3 men died. She felt his terror that he would hurt her, that the violence wired into his nervous system would surface at the wrong moment and damage something precious beyond repair. And she sent back through the bond, with every ounce of certainty she possessed, the truth. "You will not break me. I am not fragile, and I am not going anywhere." The 3 bonds complete, hummed through all 4 of them with an intensity that made breathing feel secondary. Seraphina could feel their heartbeats, their emotions, the vast, intricate, beautiful architecture of 3 minds that had been operating as a unit for 2 decades, now expanding to include a 4th. Then Seraphina did something none of them expected. She turned to Caspian and placed her mouth against his throat. "My turn," she said. Surprise rippled through the bond. Triple mate bonds were so rare that the protocols surrounding them were more historical record than living practice. The claiming was traditionally unidirectional. Alpha marks Omega. The reverse was unprecedented in living memory. Seraphina bit. Her Omega teeth were sharp enough to break his skin, and the sound Caspian made was not pain. It was recognition. Her mark on him was smaller than his on her, but equally permanent, equally visible. A declaration that this claiming went both directions. She marked Lysander next, then Fenris. Each bite deliberate, each one a statement that she had spent her entire life formulating without knowing it. "I am not yours because you claimed me. You are mine because I chose you." When all 6 marks were complete, they collapsed together on the bed in a tangle of limbs and exhaustion and the overwhelming, disorienting intimacy of 4 minds suddenly sharing emotional bandwidth. Seraphina lay with her head on Caspian's chest, Lysander's hand in hers. Fenris pressed against her back with his face buried in her hair. The bonds sang between them, not with the desperate urgency of heat or the sharp electricity of claiming, with something quieter, something that felt like the first morning after a long winter. "I love you," she said. The words came out unplanned, unstrategic, completely honest. All 3 of you. Not because of the bonds. Because of who you are when the bonds are quiet, and it is just us in a room, and you choose to be real instead of powerful. Caspian's arms tightened around her. "We did not save you," he murmured against her hair. "We found you, and you have spent every day since showing us what we were missing." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 4 heartbeats, learning to synchronize, full of bond energy settling into patterns that would strengthen over years and decades, full of the quiet, enormous, terrifying certainty that what had begun as biological accident had become the most deliberate choice any of them had ever made. Outside the chamber windows, the sun moved across the sky. Inside, 4 people lay still and breathed together and did not speak because some moments were too complete for language. The public mating ceremony took place 3 days later before thousands of witnesses. Seraphina wore silver and white with the claiming marks visible and proud on both sides of her throat and the junction of her shoulder. She stood between her mates and spoke vows that carried the weight of genuine conviction. "I, Seraphina Silvercrest, accept Caspian, Lysander, and Fenris Thornfield as my mates, my alphas, my partners in command. I vow to stand beside them in every engagement, to share the burden of intelligence and strategy, to rule with strength and compassion, and I vow to never forget where I came from, a small pack surviving through stubbornness and love." The response was overwhelming. Thousands of voices raised in acknowledgement, but in the crowd, Mordecai Ashbourne watched with calculating eyes and a smile that promised his patience had finally found its reward. 1 week later, Caspian assigned Seraphina her first major independent decision. A territorial dispute between Riverbend and Clearwater packs that had simmered for decades. Both submitted formal requests for Trinity arbitration. Seraphina threw herself into the work. 3 days of research, historical maps, representative interviews, resource distribution analysis. She emerged with a solution she believed was fair. Split the disputed territory evenly with clear demarcation and shared hunting rights. The Trinity approved. The decision was announced. Seraphina felt the quiet satisfaction of competence applied to meaningful work. 5 days later, 3 Riverbend wolves were found dead. They had attempted to access hunting grounds now legally forbidden by Seraphina's ruling. The territory she allocated did not provide adequate game during the winter months. Starvation drove them to risk trespassing into zones her decision had closed. 3 wolves, dead. Because she drew a line on a map without understanding what lived on either side of it. The news arrived during a morning briefing. Lysander delivered it with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that the worst intelligence was best presented without emotional ornamentation. Seraphina listened to the report, read the details, studied the names and ages and family connections of 3 wolves who had died because she believed her research was sufficient. Then she stood, walked to the window, placed her palms flat on the cold stone ledge, and felt, for the first time since she was 13 years old, completely and utterly unqualified for the life she was living. 3 names. Elias Riverbend, 31 years old, father of 2 daughters under the age of 6. He had been the primary hunter for his family unit, responsible for feeding not only his own children, but 3 elderly wolves who could no longer hunt for themselves. Dana Riverbend, 26, newly mated, 3 months pregnant with her first child. She had gone with Elias because she knew the old hunting trails better than anyone in the pack and believed she could guide them through safely. Thomas Riverbend, 19, Dana's younger brother. He had followed his sister because that is what 19-year-old brothers do when the people they love walk into danger. Seraphina read their names until they were carved into the architecture of her memory. She did not allow herself the mercy of abstraction. These were not statistics. They were not acceptable losses. They were a father, a pregnant woman, and a boy barely older than she had been when she took command of her own pack. And they were dead because she drew a line on a map. Caspian found her in the war room 4 hours after the briefing. She had not moved from the window, had not eaten, had not spoken to anyone through the bond, which she had learned to mute to a low hum when she needed privacy for her own thoughts. He stood beside her and said nothing for a long time. This was something she had come to understand about Caspian Thornfield. He did not fill silence with reassurance. He assessed the terrain first, determined what was needed, then acted with precision rather than impulse. 3 wolves are dead because of me. Her voice was flat, clinical, the voice of an officer delivering a casualty report, deliberately separated from the emotional payload of the information. I studied that territory for 3 days. I believed my analysis was thorough. I was wrong, and the cost of being wrong was 3 lives that cannot be recovered. Caspian's response carried no softness, no comfort designed to minimize what she was feeling. He spoke to her the way he would speak to a field commander who had lost personnel on an operation. What went wrong? Seraphina had already completed the assessment. Her tactical mind had been running the failure analysis on a loop since the moment Lysander delivered the news, even while the rest of her was drowning. I evaluated the territory based on annual resource distribution, adequate total game population, reasonable water access, defensible boundaries. What I did not account for was seasonal migration patterns. During winter months, 80% of the viable game in the section I allocated to Riverbend moves south following water sources that shift underground. My maps showed the water. They did not show that the water moves. She pressed her fingers harder against the stone ledge. I needed a hydrologist, an ecologist, someone who understood that territory the way the wolves who hunt it understand it. I needed to consult people who had spent their lives on that land instead of assuming that 3 days of research from a fortress 200 miles away was sufficient. You made an error, Caspian said. His voice was steady, not unkind, but completely unwilling to soften the reality. It happens to every leader who has ever made decisions affecting lives they cannot see from where they stand. The question is not whether you failed. You did. The question is what you do now. What I do. Seraphina turned from the window and looked at him with eyes that burned but refused to produce tears. What I do is acknowledge that I am not ready for this. That 7 years of keeping 47 wolves alive does not qualify me to make decisions affecting thousands. No. Caspian said. The word landed like a closed door. What you do is take responsibility publicly, implement corrections, compensate the families, learn from what went wrong so thoroughly that this specific failure becomes impossible to repeat. And then you continue. Because abdicating does not resurrect the dead. It only guarantees that the next person to hold your authority makes the same mistakes without your motivation to prevent them. The door to the war room opened. Lysander entered carrying a tablet displaying detailed analysis, topographic overlays, seasonal water migration charts, winter game population distribution curves. I have prepared a full briefing on what went wrong, he said. Every variable your original assessment missed. Seasonal water sources, underground aquifer shifts, migration corridors that are only active during the 4 coldest months. If you want to address this properly, You need to understand all of it. Behind him, Fenris leaned against the doorframe. His arms were crossed. His expression held no pity, which Seraphina found more steadying than any amount of gentle consolation could have provided. "The court will expect a response," Fenris said. "Silence makes this worse. But how you frame it determines whether they see incompetence or accountability. One destroys credibility. The other builds it." Seraphina looked at the three of them. These men who had held her through heat and marked her throat with permanent bonds were not trying to make her feel better. They were treating her like what she had demanded to be treated as: a partner, an equal, a leader who had failed and needed operational guidance, not emotional rescue. Her father's voice, so clear it might have been speaking from the doorway beside Fenris. "Learn from every failure. The only unforgivable mistake is refusing to adapt afterward." Something shifted inside her chest. The paralysis of guilt began to fracture, and through the cracks, something harder and more useful pushed upward. Not confidence. She had no right to confidence. But resolve. The decision that 3 deaths would mean something beyond tragedy. That their names would become the foundation of every decision she made from this point forward. "I need to call an emergency assembly," she said. Her voice had changed, still carrying the weight of what she had caused, but no longer buckling under it. "Publicly acknowledge the error. Revoke the flawed ruling. Present corrected boundaries based on Lysander's analysis. Compensate the families with full crown support, resource allocation, and guaranteed multi-territory hunting rights." She paused. "And I need to look every wolf in that assembly in the eye while I do it." Caspian nodded. "That is exactly right." Fenris pushed off the doorframe. "I will handle security for the assembly. Tempers will be high." Lysander was already working his tablet. "I will have the corrected territorial analysis ready within the hour, verified by the Riverbend Pack's own hunting masters." Caspian moved closer to her. Not touching, just present. His voice dropped to a register that was only for her. "This will hurt, Seraphina. Standing in front of hundreds of wolves, many of whom already question whether you belong here, and admitting that your decision killed 3 of their people. It is one of the hardest things a leader ever does." He held her gaze. "But it is what separates genuine leadership from people who merely hold titles. The emergency assembly was brutal. The throne room held perhaps 600 wolves, and Seraphina could feel the collective weight of their judgment pressing against her skin like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Many had been waiting for exactly this failure. Confirmation that the border pack Omega elevated to queen was exactly what they suspected. Unqualified, dangerous. A mistake the goddess made that the Trinity was too infatuated to correct. Seraphina stood before them without notes, without prepared remarks, without the safety of her mates beside her on the dais. She had insisted on standing alone for this. The error was hers. The accountability would be hers. Sharing the stage would dilute the message. "I made an error in tactical assessment." Her voice carried with the authority of a woman who had spent 7 years learning that projection was survival. "In analyzing the Riverbend and Clearwater territorial dispute, I failed to properly research seasonal resource patterns. I relied on annual data without consulting the wolves who live on and hunt that land daily. My decision created an unjust boundary that directly contributed to 3 wolves losing their lives." She let the words settle, did not rush past them, did not pivot to solutions to escape the discomfort of admission. Their names were Elias Riverbend Dana Riverbend, and Thomas Riverbend. Elias was a father. Dana was pregnant with her first child. Thomas was 19 years old. They deserve to be remembered as people, not as a line item in a ruling that should never have been issued. The murmur that moved through the assembly was complex: anger, grief, and beneath both, the disorientation of witnessing a leader do something most of them had never seen. Admit fault without deflection. I am revoking my previous ruling. The boundary will be redrawn with proper analysis, verified by experts from both packs and independent specialists in hydrology and seasonal ecology. The families of the deceased will receive full Crown support, resource allocation, guaranteed hunting rights across multiple territories, and my personal commitment that this failure becomes the foundation of a new protocol requiring specialist consultation before any territorial decision is finalized. She paused, let her eyes move across the crowd the way her father had taught her, not avoiding the hostile faces, meeting them. I am still learning to operate at this level. I will make mistakes, but I promise you 3 things. I will always take responsibility. I will always prioritize the welfare of every wolf over my own pride. And I will learn from every failure so that the cost paid by Elias, Dana, and Thomas was not paid for nothing. The response was not applause. It was not universal acceptance. But in the shifting currents of the assembly, Seraphina felt something change. Not trust, not yet. But the possibility of trust. The recognition that a leader willing to bleed publicly for her mistakes might, given time, be worth following. After the assembly dispersed, Mordecai Ashbourne appeared at her side with the inevitability of a predator drawn to the scent of wounded prey. Quite the performance. His voice carried admiration so precisely calibrated that it was indistinguishable from mockery, turning catastrophic incompetence into a display of humility. One might almost think you engineered the entire situation for political effect, though 3 dead wolves does seem a steep price for public sympathy. 3 wolves died because I made an error, Seraphina said. She did not look at him. She looked past him at the families filing out of the assembly, carrying grief that her words could acknowledge but never repair. That is not theater. That is tragedy. Mordecai's smile sharpened by a single degree. Young leaders often make costly mistakes when operating beyond their experience. I do hope your future errors will not be quite so fatal. He withdrew. Seraphina watched him go and cataloged 2 additional eye contact exchanges with wolves in the departing crowd. 6 total sympathizers she had now identified. She added them to the mental file she was building and said nothing. That night, in the darkness of their chambers, the weight finally found her. She had maintained composure through the assembly, through the family meetings, through the policy revision sessions and the security debriefings, and the 17 other demands the day had made on a woman who had killed 3 people with a map and a pen. But lying between her mates, feeling their warmth and their heartbeats, and the steady hum of bonds that connected 4 nervous systems into a shared emotional architecture, the walls came down. 3 wolves died because of me. The words came out broken. The controlled leader who had addressed 600 wolves with authority was gone. What remained was a woman who was 23 days past her 18th birthday and already carrying names she would never be able to set down. Lysander pulled her closer. His arm tightened around her waist. You made a mistake, a serious one, but you handled the aftermath exactly right. Took responsibility, implemented corrections, compensated families. That matters. Does it? Does taking responsibility bring them back? No, Caspian said quietly from her other side. It does not. Nothing brings them back. That is the truth of command, and you will carry it for the rest of your life the way I carry 14 names, and Lysander carries the messages he could not intercept fast enough, and Fenris carries 3 soldiers on a road that was supposed to be clear. His hand found hers in the darkness. We carry our dead. We learn from them. We try to be better. That is all leadership is, Seraphina. Making the best decisions possible with available information. Taking responsibility when those decisions fail. Adapting so the failure means something. Fenris spoke from behind her, his voice rough against her hair. The wolves who matter will respect you for what you did today. The ones who will use it to dismiss you were looking for excuses before you ever opened your mouth. Focus on the mission. Get better. Make fewer errors. Build something worth the cost. Seraphina let their words settle into the empty spaces that grief had carved. She did not feel better. She was not supposed to feel better. 3 people were dead, and feeling better would be an insult to the magnitude of that reality. But she felt less alone, and she felt the first fragile stirrings of something that was not forgiveness, because she was not ready for that, and might never be, but was perhaps the next thing. The decision that Elias and Dana and Thomas deserved a leader who learned from their deaths rather than one who was destroyed by them. She chose to learn. The weeks that followed saw Seraphina attack her education with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Every decision now began with specialist consultation, hydrologists, ecologists, pack historians, cultural advisors. She built a network of expertise that turned the Trinity's decision-making process from authoritative decree into collaborative assessment. Her second arbitration took 2 weeks of exhaustive research before she proposed a solution. When implemented, both packs accepted without significant complaint, not because it made everyone happy, but because it was so demonstrably thorough that challenging it would require producing better evidence than Seraphina had already gathered. Fenris increased her combat training to daily sessions with new intensity. The exercises changed. Less technique, more scenario. He would construct tactical situations and force her to solve them while physically exhausted, because real combat never happened when you were fresh and prepared. If Mordecai sends people for you, he said between drills, they will not wait for a convenient moment. You need to survive long enough for us to reach you. Every second counts. Every decision matters. You do not have the luxury of freezing. The intimacy that night was different from anything before. They came together in the quiet hours, long after the fortress had gone still. No heat driving them. No bond crisis demanding completion. Just 4 people who had spent the day preparing for violence, choosing instead to be gentle with each other. Seraphina lay in the center of their bed and felt Lysander trace the claiming marks on her throat with his fingertips. Slow, reverent, as though memorizing the geography of something precious. Fenris held her hand, just held it. The man who communicated primarily through tactical assessment and controlled violence, holding her hand in the dark with a grip that said everything his vocabulary could not. Caspian pressed his lips to her shoulder where his own mark lived. If something happens tomorrow, he said softly. If Mordecai moves, and the operation goes wrong, and somehow the worst becomes real. She placed her fingers over his mouth. Do not finish that sentence, Seraphina. I know what you are trying to say. She turned to face him, And I am telling you that I did not survive 7 years of leading a pack on the edge of starvation, and walk into this fortress during my first heat, and negotiate terms with 3 alpha kings and survive the worst mistake of my life, just to lose any of you to a man who has spent 5 years being patient. She kissed him, slow and deep and deliberate. We are going to win, because we are smarter and we have something he does not. What is that? Something worth protecting. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of 4 people breathing together in the dark, aware that the morning would bring operational briefings and threat assessments and the possibility of genuine danger, choosing to hold this moment in their bodies like a prayer they did not need to speak aloud. Fenris's arm tightened around her. Lysander's thumb traced circles on her palm. Caspian's heartbeat steadied against her back, and Seraphina lay awake long after the others slept, staring at the ceiling, running scenarios the way her father taught her. If this, then this. If that variable changes, this adjustment, planning, preparing, building flexibility into her thinking so that when reality diverged from projection, and it always did, she would adapt. 3 names lived in her chest beside the mate bonds: Elias, Dana, Thomas. They would stay there forever. She would make sure of it. Dawn arrived with the sound of movement in the corridors, guards changing rotation, staff preparing the fortress for the diplomatic summit that would begin in 6 hours. Hundreds of wolves from dozens of packs converging on Obsidian Fortress for trade negotiations and territorial discussions. Fenris was already awake, already dressed, already armed. He stood by the window checking sightlines with the automatic discipline of a man for whom threat assessment was as natural as breathing. Seraphina sat up in bed. The sheet fell to her waist, and the cool morning air found the claiming marks on her throat. She touched them briefly. 3 sets of teeth, 3 permanent declarations, and beneath them the silver pendant her mother had worn. She swung her legs to the floor and reached for the clothes that had been laid out for her. Formal, but functional. Silver and white, but cut for movement rather than ceremony. Fenris turned from the window. His eyes moved over her with an assessment that was equal parts strategic and personal. He crossed the room, placed one hand on the side of her neck, his thumb resting against the mark he had left on her shoulder. His silver eyes held a question he would never articulate in full sentences. Seraphina covered his hand with hers. "Ready," she said. His mouth twitched. The closest thing to a smile Fenris Thornfield produced outside of combat. "Ready," he confirmed. The diplomatic summit filled Obsidian Fortress with more wolves than Seraphina had ever seen in a single location. Delegations from 23 packs occupied the main assembly hall, their alphas and advisors arranged in concentric arcs around a central podium. The architecture of the space forced every speaker to stand surrounded, visible from all angles. No corners, no blind spots. The design was deliberate. A room built for honesty, or at least for making dishonesty extremely expensive. Seraphina stood at the podium presenting her Omega advocacy reforms. 6 weeks of research condensed into a proposal that would restructure how vulnerable pack members were identified, monitored, and protected across the Northern Territories. She had built the framework on Lysander's intelligence data, grounded it in the specialist consultation model, born from the Riverbend failure, and pressure-tested every clause against the political realities Caspian had spent hours teaching her to navigate. Her voice was steady. Her arguments were precise. She had rehearsed nothing because the information lived inside her now. woven into the same neural pathways that held her father's tactical training and 7 years of crisis leadership and the names of 3 wolves whose deaths had taught her what thoroughness actually required. The room was listening. Not all of them favorably, but all of them attentively, and Seraphina had learned from Caspian that attention was the first prerequisite for persuasion. She did not see the attack begin. No one did. That was the point. 5 operatives breached the assembly hall through a service corridor that connected to the kitchen staging area. They moved during the session changeover, that narrow window when delegations shifted between venues and guard positions rotated to accommodate the movement of hundreds of wolves through multiple corridors simultaneously. The timing was surgical. The execution was professional. Former military, enhanced capabilities, clearly trained for exactly this scenario, exactly this target. Seraphina registered the first anomaly as a sound, a scuffle behind the eastern doors that lasted 2 seconds and ended with a wet thud that her combat-trained ears identified immediately as a body hitting stone. The crowd had not noticed. They were still settling into new positions, conversations overlapping, chairs scraping. But Seraphina's nervous system had been rewired by months of Fenris Thornfield's training. The drills he ran at dawn and dusk and midnight and every inconvenient hour between, designed not to teach technique, but to reprogram instinct. To make threat assessment as automatic as blinking. 3 seconds. That was how long she had between registering the sound and the first operative clearing the eastern doorway. 3 seconds to evaluate. 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds to become something other than a target. Her eyes swept the room with the speed her father had trained into her since childhood. 5 hostiles. 2 entering from the east door. 2 from the service corridor. 1 dropping from the upper gallery, where a ventilation shaft provided access that should have been sealed. 2 exits, both blocked. 18 civilians in the immediate blast radius. Delegates, advisors, elder representatives. Wolves who had come to discuss trade policy and were about to find themselves in a combat zone. The first operative moved toward her. He was fast, trained, confident in the assumption that his target was a political figure who would freeze under direct threat. His trajectory was straight line. Efficient. The approach of a man who expected compliance, not resistance. Seraphina did not freeze. She moved off the podium in a direction the operative did not anticipate because it was toward him rather than away. His momentum was committed to a forward path. She redirected it. Fenris had drilled this technique into her muscle memory over hundreds of repetitions. Use their size, use their speed, use the physics of a larger body traveling in a straight line against the person inhabiting that body. Her hands found his arm. Her hip dropped beneath his center of gravity. Her legs drove upward and sideways with every ounce of force her frame could generate, and his own momentum did the rest. He went over her and down, hard, his knee striking the stone floor at an angle that produced a sound like green wood snapping. He did not get up. The room erupted. Screams from delegates. Chairs overturning. The chaotic compression of 100 wolves suddenly discovering that the fortress they trusted to protect them had been penetrated. The second operative hesitated. 1.3 seconds of recalculation. His target had just disabled a trained combatant with a technique that suggested professional instruction, and his tactical assumptions were reorganizing around this new information. That hesitation was the last mistake he made voluntarily. Brenna Stormvale materialized from the crowd with the focused velocity of a woman who had spent her entire adult life training for the moment when her best friend needed a blade between herself and harm. Her combat knife was already drawn. She engaged the second operative with a brutality that was technically precise and emotionally uncomplicated. He went down in 4 seconds. He did not die because Brenna was good enough to choose where her knife landed, and the landing she chose was disabling rather than lethal. 2 down, 3 remaining. The operatives from the service corridor and the one who had dropped from the gallery were converging on their position. They had recovered from the surprise of competent resistance and were adapting their approach. Professional, coordinated, communicating through hand signals that Seraphina recognized from her father's descriptions of special operations protocols. Seraphina grabbed a chair. Not elegant, not tactical doctrine, but Fenris had taught her that real combat was not about elegance. It was about ending threats with whatever was available, and a wooden chair with iron joints was a remarkably effective weapon when applied to the knee of someone who did not expect a 5'6" Omega to go on the offensive. She and Brenna held the line together, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had stood through every crisis since childhood. Brenna's knife and Seraphina's improvised weapons, and the shared understanding of 2 women who had survived enough together that coordination did not require communication. 47 seconds. That was how long they held. Seraphina counted each one because counting kept her mind in tactical mode, and tactical mode kept her alive. 47 seconds of blocking, redirecting, striking, absorbing impacts that would leave bruises she would feel for weeks, protecting the 18 civilians behind them who had pressed against the far wall in varying states of shock and terror. On the 32nd second, one of the operatives landed a strike across Seraphina's cheekbone. She felt the skin split, felt blood begin its warm descent toward her jaw. The pain was sharp and immediate, and her wolf surged forward with a rage that was not tactical, but primal. She did not let it take control. She channeled it. On the 41st second, Seraphina felt the mate bond flare like a distress signal detonating in 3 directions simultaneously. Caspian, Lysander, Fenris, receiving in a single instant the full sensory feed of her situation, her fear, her pain, her absolute refusal to go down. On the 47th second, the doors of the assembly hall blew inward, and overwhelming force arrived in the form of Fenris Thornfield at the front of a quick reaction team that moved through the remaining operatives with the efficiency of men who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. The 3 remaining attackers were on the ground in under 90 seconds. Alive. All of them alive because in the fraction of a second between engagement and neutralization, Seraphina had shouted a single word that cut through the chaos with command authority. Alive. Fenris had heard, had communicated through the bond, had redirected lethal force to disabling force without breaking stride. Dead men could not provide intelligence. Seraphina had learned that from every military history text her father had made her study. The defeated were only useful when they could still speak. When the room stabilized, when the quick reaction team had secured the operatives and the delegates were being evacuated through cleared corridors, Seraphina stood in the center of the assembly hall, breathing hard, blood running down her cheek, Brenna beside her with a split lip and eyes that were still scanning for threats. Caspian reached her first. His hands found her face, and his fingers traced the wound on her cheekbone with a precision that was simultaneously medical assessment and barely contained fury. His eyes blazed silver, the controlled strategist fracturing around edges that revealed something far more dangerous beneath. "Are you hurt?" Anything beyond this? I am fine. Her hands were trembling as adrenaline surrendered its grip on her nervous system. They did not account for me knowing how to fight. Tactical error on their part. Fenris appeared beside her. His eyes moved over the disabled operatives on the floor with an assessment that held savage professional pride. He looked at Seraphina, looked at the operative she had put down with the momentum redirect he had drilled into her over hundreds of sessions. 47 seconds, he said. You held defensive position against 5 trained operatives for 47 seconds. That is not just knowing how to fight, Seraphina. That is combat effectiveness. Lysander was already coordinating intelligence response, his tablet active, his communications network engaging assets across the territory. But he paused long enough to cross the room and press his forehead against hers. A gesture that lasted 3 seconds. Said everything. The captured operatives broke under Lysander's interrogation within hours. He did not use violence. He did not need to. 20 years of intelligence work had taught him that psychological pressure applied by someone who understood exactly which threads to pull was infinitely more effective than physical pain, which only produced the answers the subject believed the interrogator wanted to hear. What he extracted was comprehensive. Mordecai Ashbourne's entire network, communication protocols, financial backers, safe houses, assets positioned across the northern territories. 5 years of careful, patient infrastructure building spilled across Lysander's interrogation room floor because operatives who had been told their target would be a terrified Omega had instead encountered a woman who broke their kneecaps and demanded they be kept alive. The panic of unexpected resistance had shattered their training discipline, and once the first crack appeared, Lysander drove the wedge with surgical precision. He displayed the intelligence in the war room 6 hours after the attack. Maps covered in connection lines, financial networks rendered visible, communication chains traced to their origins. The entire architecture of Mordecai's conspiracy laid bare. 5 years, Lysander said. He has been building infrastructure for a coup attempt that would have destabilized the entire northern territories. The assassination was not designed to succeed. It was designed to create chaos, panic, a moment of vulnerability he could exploit to accelerate his timeline. He paused. But because Seraphina fought back, his operatives revealed information they were trained to protect to the death. Their psychological preparation assumed a soft target. They got a hard one, and their entire operational security collapsed. Fenris studied the network map with the focus of a predator identifying the precise location of prey that had been evading him for half a decade. We have everything, every asset, every communication channel, every financial connection. We can roll up his entire network in 72 hours. Not yet. Every head in the room turned to Seraphina. She stood at the tactical display, blood cleaned from her face, but the wound still visible, a thin line across her cheekbone that would scar. Her eyes were moving across the network map with the same focused intensity her father had worn when reading terrain before an operation. If we move now, we capture his network, but we lose him. He is too smart to be directly connected to any of these nodes. There will be cutout layers between him and every operative we have identified. We will disrupt his infrastructure, yes, but he will escape. And in 5 more years, he will have rebuilt, and we will be doing this again. She moved to the display and highlighted the pattern she had been reading since the attack. The pattern that had been invisible when she first identified it weeks ago, but was now luminous with confirmation. We need him to commit personally. Make a move that exposes him directly, not through intermediaries. not through deniable assets. Caspian's eyes narrowed. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to use carefully constructed intelligence as bait, Seraphina corrected. We leak false medical reports through the channel's Mordecai monitors, reports indicating I was seriously injured in the attack, that my condition is unstable, that the Trinity is distracted managing the crisis and has reduced security to reallocate resources to my medical care. She turned to face her mates. He has been patient for 5 years because he has never had an opening worth risking personal exposure for. We give him that opening, make it irresistible. And when he steps through, we close the door behind him with overwhelming force. The bond carried the weight of what she was proposing. 3 alpha mates processing the tactical logic and the personal terror simultaneously. Seraphina felt their resistance, not to the strategy, which was sound, to the risk, to the image of her standing in the center of a trap, with a man who had spent 5 years planning to destroy everything they had built. It is dangerous, Lysander said. If he commits and something goes wrong, then we adapt. That is what tactical operations are. Controlled risk with contingency planning. My father taught me that battles are won by forcing the enemy to fight on ground you have chosen. This is choosing our ground. She held Caspian's gaze. He was running calculations. She could feel it through the bond. Variables and probabilities and response matrices, and the fundamental tension between strategic logic and the primal alpha imperative to keep his mate as far from danger as physically possible. We do it, Caspian said. His voice carried the weight of command authority, accepting a plan he knew was correct and hated nonetheless. But we build redundancy into every layer, multiple extraction plans, overwhelming force staged within seconds of the engagement zone. This operation has a 0 acceptable casualty rate. His silver eyes held hers. Especially you. The trap took 2 weeks to construct. Lysander designed the false intelligence with the meticulous attention to detail that made his work indistinguishable from reality. Medical reports were generated through channels known to be compromised. Security protocols were visibly reduced in ways that appeared reactive rather than deliberate. The Trinity made public appearances that suggested distraction and diminished capacity. Every detail was crafted to tell a story that Mordecai Ashbourne's analytical mind would find irresistible. A wounded queen, distracted kings, a fortress with gaps in its defenses. Mordecai took the bait. His second operation was larger, better coordinated. A full assault team with equipment and planning that spoke to months of preparation accelerated into weeks because the opportunity appeared too perfect to defer. They came in force, intending to extract or eliminate Seraphina, while the Trinity was supposedly away managing outlying crises. The Trinity was not away. Seraphina was not wounded. And every step of Mordecai's assault team was monitored from the moment they crossed into the territory. They entered a fortress where every corridor was covered by overlapping fields of fire, every exit controlled, every shadow occupied by wolves operating under wartime rules of engagement. The assault team was captured alive within minutes, given no opportunity to fight, no opportunity to flee. No opportunity to activate the contingency protocols that Mordecai had undoubtedly prepared for the possibility of failure. Mordecai himself was taken attempting to use an escape route he had prepared years in advance, a tunnel beneath the fortress's eastern wall that connected to an underground waterway leading outside the defensive perimeter. Lysander's intelligence network had identified it 3 weeks prior. Assets had been positioned at the exit since before the trap was set. The man who had spent 5 years being patient walked into the one scenario his patience had not prepared him for. An enemy who understood that his greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability. That patience becomes predictable when it meets someone willing to let the clock run. The trial lasted 3 days. Public proceedings in the same throne room where Seraphina had first encountered 3 mate bonds that should not have existed. Every piece of evidence laid out in sequence, communications decoded, financial transactions traced through 7 shell companies to accounts Mordecai controlled directly. Testimony from captured operatives describing 5 years of conspiracy in exhaustive, damning detail. Mordecai's defense crumbled under the weight of proof so comprehensive that even his sympathizers in the assembly found their positions untenable. The 6 wolves Seraphina had identified through months of observation, the ones who made eye contact with him a beat too long, sat in the gallery and said nothing. When the proceedings reached their conclusion, Caspian turned to Seraphina. The gesture was deliberate, public, witnessed by every wolf in the throne room. He was not asking for her input on sentencing. He was demonstrating, before 1,000 witnesses, that the authority to decide rested equally in her hands. Seraphina stood. The wound on her cheek had closed into a thin scar that caught the torchlight. The silver pendant lay against her collarbone. The claiming marks on her throat were visible above her formal collar. She looked at Mordecai Ashbourne. He looked back with the cold composure of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome and found none of them acceptable, but all of them survivable. "Exile," Seraphina said. The word moved through the throne room like wind through grass, stripped of all rank. Forbidden from entering any Trinity territory. Permanent monitoring by intelligence assets to ensure compliance. Seraphina paused. She felt the surprise through the bond, felt the crowd's confusion, felt Mordecai's own sharp reassessment. Execution would make him a martyr, she continued. His sympathizers would have a cause. His memory would become a rallying point for every wolf who preferred the old ways. That is not justice. That is recruitment. Her eyes held Mordecai's. Exile makes him an example, a man who spent 5 years building an empire of ambition and lost everything, not to violence, not to tyranny, to accountability and evidence and a legal process that gave him more fairness than he ever intended to extend to us. She addressed the assembly. "We are not the old council. We do not rule through fear of execution. We rule through the demonstration that our systems work, that justice applies equally, that even our enemies receive due process. That is not weakness. That is the difference between authority that is seized and authority that is earned. The vote was not unanimous. It never would be. But the majority held, and the sentence was entered into record with Seraphina's name beside it. Mordecai was escorted from the fortress under armed guard. At the territorial boundary, the guards allowed him a moment to stand on soil he would never be permitted to touch again. He turned to look back at Obsidian Fortress, at Seraphina, who had walked to the boundary with her mates to witness the completion of the operation she had designed. "You think you have won, girl." His voice carried across the distance with the precision of a man who chose every word as a weapon. "You are still playing at being queen." Seraphina held his gaze. 3 mate bonds hummed in her chest, a scar on her cheek, a pendant at her throat, 3 names carved into her memory that would never leave. "No," she said calmly. "I am a soldier who completed a mission." "There is a difference." Mordecai turned and walked across the boundary line and did not look back again. Fenris appeared at her side. His hand found the small of her back. The touch said more than any debrief could communicate. Caspian took her right hand, Lysander her left. They stood at the boundary in formation that had become as natural as breathing. 4 people who had entered each other's lives through biology and necessity and had built something that transcended both. "It is over," Lysander said quietly. Seraphina watched Mordecai's figure diminish against the horizon. The man who had measured her, tested her, attempted to destroy her, reduced now to a silhouette walking away from everything he had spent 5 years constructing. She thought about saying something profound, something worthy of the moment. Instead, she leaned into Fenris's hand at her back and felt Caspian's fingers tighten around hers and listened to Lysander's steady breathing beside her. "This part is over," she said. And she meant it as both conclusion and promise. The throne room had witnessed executions and coronations and the quiet machinery of power changing hands across generations of wolves who believed their authority was permanent. Its black stone walls held memory the way deep water holds temperature, slowly and without sentiment. Seraphina stood at the podium 3 days after Mordecai Ashbourne's exile and looked out at an assembly that was fundamentally different from the one that had questioned her qualifications 7 weeks ago. The faces were the same. The hierarchy was the same. But something in the way they looked at her had shifted, and she could feel it the way a sailor feels the current change beneath a boat that appears to be sitting still. She did not wear a crown. The Trinity had never adopted the tradition. Their authority was functional, not ornamental, and Seraphina intended to keep it that way. What she wore was the silver pendant at her throat, her mother's. The chain so thin it was nearly invisible against her skin, but the weight of it as familiar as her own pulse. She had touched it in fear the night she walked into this room for the first time. She had gripped it for strength during 47 seconds of combat. Now it rested against her collarbone with the settled permanence of something that had found its final resting place. She began without preamble. 7 weeks ago, I stood in this room and told you I did not need 3 kings to give me power, that I already had it. Those words were true, but incomplete. Power without structure is just survival. I survived for 7 years. I kept 47 wolves alive through winters that should have buried us. But surviving is not building. It is not changing the conditions that make survival necessary in the first place. She paused. The room was silent in the way that meant listening rather than waiting. 3 weeks ago, I made a decision that killed 3 wolves. Their names were Elias, Dana, and Thomas Riverbend. I made that decision because I believed my own analysis was sufficient, because I did not consult the people who understood the territory I was dividing, because the systems we had in place did not require me to. Her voice carried without strain. 7 years of projecting authority across rooms that did not want to hear her had made vocal command as natural as breathing. That failure taught me something that success never could. The decisions we make from this podium ripple outward into lives we cannot see from where we stand. And the only way to ensure those ripples do not become waves that drown people is to build systems that are smarter than any individual, including me. She activated the display behind her. Charts, frameworks, policy architecture rendered in clean lines and clear language. Effective immediately, all territorial arbitration decisions require specialist consultation from a minimum of 3 independent experts. Hydrologists for water resource disputes, ecologists for habitat and migration conflicts, cultural advisors from the affected pacts for disputes involving traditional lands, No ruling will be issued until the consulting panel has signed off on the resource impact analysis. She advanced to the next display. Second, the small pack representation framework. Every pack with fewer than 100 members will elect a delegate to a new advisory council that reports directly to the Trinity. Their role is not ceremonial. They will have review authority over any policy that disproportionately affects small or border packs. Their objections will be entered into formal record and require written response from the ruling body before any contested policy can be implemented. Murmurs. Not hostile. Calculating. Alphas of large packs recognizing that their uncontested influence was being restructured, and smaller pack representatives in the gallery exchanging glances that carried the particular brightness of people hearing their own existence acknowledged in the language of power for the first time. Third, Omega protection reform. Seraphina's voice did not change in volume or cadence, but something in its frequency shifted. Something that came from Lysander's intelligence reports and a 15-year-old girl's letter and every intercepted message that documented the quiet, ongoing catastrophe of wolves being treated as property rather than people. The current protections are insufficient. They define consent in legal terms, but do not address the structural conditions that make genuine consent impossible for wolves who have no economic independence, no educational access, and no realistic means of leaving situations that violate their autonomy. She met eyes throughout the room. Large pack alphas, small pack delegates, elders who remembered the old ways, young wolves who had never known anything but Trinity rule. The new framework will establish Omega education centers in every territory, economic independence programs including land grants and trade apprenticeships, legal advocacy services funded by the Crown and operated independently of any pack hierarchy, and a confidential reporting system for abuse that routes directly to the Trinity Intelligence Network, bypassing local pack authority entirely. She paused to let the architecture of what she was proposing settle into the room. Every wolf in this territory will have voice and choice, not as a slogan, as measurable, enforceable, funded policy. Because the measure of our leadership is not whether the powerful are comfortable. It is whether the vulnerable are safe. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Seraphina counted them through the bond where Caspian's pride hummed like a low electrical current, and Lysander's emotion was so intense he had temporarily lost the ability to process it analytically, and Fenris was simply still in the way he was, only still when something had reached him at a depth his defenses could not intercept. Then, Elder Isolde Greymore rose from her seat in the front row. 87 years old. White hair, eyes that had watched 3 generations of leadership rise and fail and occasionally, rarely, transcend. The old woman looked at Seraphina for a long moment. Then she began to clap. It was not thunderous. It was the measured, deliberate applause of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between performance and genuine transformation. But it was enough. Others followed, not all. Perhaps not even most, but enough to fill the throne room with a sound that meant something had shifted in the bedrock of how the Northern Territories understood themselves. Seraphina stepped down from the podium, and Caspian was there. Not in front of her. Beside her. Exactly where a partner stands. The years that followed moved at the speed of seasons changing. Not the frantic pace of crisis management that had defined Seraphina's first weeks at Obsidian Fortress. Something slower, deeper. The gradual accumulation of days that were individually unremarkable, but collectively transformative. The way a river shapes stone not through force, but through the patient repetition of showing up. The specialist consultation model became standard practice within 6 months. Territorial disputes that had festered for decades were resolved through processes so thorough that the resulting agreements held without enforcement. Pacts that had submitted to Trinity authority out of fear began cooperating out of recognition that the system actually worked. The small pack advisory council found its voice within the first year. Tentatively at first, delegates testing whether their objections would actually be heard or merely recorded and filed. When the first contested policy was modified based on their feedback, the dynamic shifted. Participation increased. Quality of input improved. The advisory council became not a symbolic gesture, but a functional component of governance that made every decision measurably better. Lysander's Omega protection reforms saved lives in numbers that could be quantified and in ways that could not. The education centers opened. The economic programs launched. The confidential reporting system intercepted situations that would have disappeared into the silence of pack hierarchy. Wolves who had never imagined alternatives discovered that alternatives existed, and in the private spaces of Obsidian Fortress, away from policy documents and territorial maps and the machinery of governance, 4 people built a family. Lyra arrived in the 2nd year. Seraphina labored for 14 hours and produced a daughter who opened her eyes and looked at the world with an expression of serious assessment that made Caspian laugh for the first time since Seraphina had known him. Not the controlled exhale that passed for amusement in his usual register. An actual laugh, spontaneous and unguarded and so startling that Lysander nearly dropped the blanket he was holding. "She has your face," Lysander said, wrapping the infant with hands that were perfectly steady during intelligence briefings and trembling now. And Caspian's expression. "She is already evaluating tactical options." Fenris stood by the window. He had not moved during the entire labor, had not spoken, had watched with the rigid stillness of a man experiencing an emotion he had no protocol for processing. When Seraphina looked at him, she saw something on his face that she had never seen there before. Terror. Not the combat variety he had spent decades managing. The other kind. The kind that came from caring about something so much that the possibility of losing it rewired your entire nervous system. "Come here," Seraphina said. Her voice was exhausted and raw and certain. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the infant in her arms the way he looked at unexploded ordnance, with absolute attention and the awareness that one wrong move could cause irreparable damage. She placed Lyra in his arms, his hands scarred across every knuckle, calloused from decades of weapons handling, capable of violence so efficient it bordered on art, cradled his daughter with a gentleness that made Seraphina's chest ache. "I do not know how to do this," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I know how to protect, how to fight, how to neutralize threats and secure perimeters and assess risk. I do not know how to be what she needs." Seraphina placed her hand over his where it supported Lyra's head. "She needs a father who will protect her. And she needs a father who is brave enough to be gentle. You have both. You have always had both." Fenris looked at her, then at his daughter, then back at Seraphina, with an expression that contained more vulnerability than all of his nightmare confessions combined. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply held his daughter and breathed and let the moment exist without trying to assess it tactically. Rowan came 3 years later, a boy with Lysander's analytical intensity and a tendency to observe before engaging that manifested as long, focused silences during which he appeared to be cataloging everything in his environment. At 7, he would prefer books to roughhousing, At 8, he would begin reorganizing the fortress library by subject matter without being asked. Lysander would find him there on quiet afternoons, and they would read together in companionable silence, two analytical minds sharing space without requiring conversation to justify the proximity. The twins arrived in the 5th year, Marcus and Sage, fraternal, loud, possessed of a combined energy that exceeded their individual mass by a factor Seraphina suspected violated basic physics. Marcus had Fenris's intensity without his restraint, a combination that resulted in furniture being climbed, guards being ambushed, and training equipment being repurposed for uses their designers had never anticipated. Sage had Seraphina's stubbornness welded to an imagination that turned every room into a strategic scenario requiring immediate resolution. Caspian watched them with the expression of a man performing long-range forecasting. Their teenage years, he said one evening, observing the twins dismantle and reassemble a guard's communications unit with alarming speed, are going to be operationally significant. Seraphina laughed. It was a sound that surprised her every time she produced it, because for 7 years, laughter had been a luxury her life did not accommodate. And now it came easily, frequently. In response to Caspian's dry observations and Lysander's terrible puns and Fenris's rare but devastating deadpan humor, and the daily absurdity of raising 4 children in a military fortress with 3 alpha kings who commanded armies and could not successfully negotiate bedtime, Brenna Stormvale found her own mate in the 8th year, a beta male named Callum who taught history at one of the Omega education centers and who possessed the rare quality of being completely unintimidated by the fact that his partner could disable him in under 3 seconds. He adored her with the open, uncomplicated devotion of a man who understood exactly what he had found and intended to deserve it. Seraphina stood beside Brenna at the mating ceremony and held her hand during the vows and did not cry until afterward, in the corridor, where Fenris found her leaning against the wall with tears streaming down her face, and an expression of such concentrated happiness that he initially misread it as distress. "She deserves this," Seraphina said. "She has stood beside me since we were children, through everything, every crisis, every loss, every moment when I was certain that the next day would be the one that finally broke us. She deserves someone who looks at her the way Callum does. Like she is the answer to a question he has been asking his entire life." Fenris leaned against the wall beside her. He did not touch her. He simply occupied adjacent space in the way that had become his primary language of love. Present, proximate, permanent. "You deserve it too," he said. Seraphina looked at him. "I have it. ×3. He almost smiled. Almost. Silvercrest Pack tripled in size across the decade. Seraphina's weekly visits, negotiated on the morning after her first heat with the ferocity of a woman who understood that connection to her origins was not a luxury, but a structural necessity, had evolved into a relationship between Pack and Crown that served as a model for integration across the territories. Her wolves did not lose their alpha when she became queen. They gained access to resources, protection, infrastructure, and a direct channel to the highest level of governance in the Northern Territories. Young wolves from Silvercrest apprenticed in the fortress. Experienced wolves from Silvercrest served as consultants for the Small Pack Advisory Council. The pack that had once been a vulnerable afterthought on a contested border became a thriving demonstration of what happened when small communities were invested in rather than overlooked. On the 10th anniversary of her mating, Seraphina stood on the palace balcony and watched her children play in the gardens below. Lyra, 10 years old, had organized her siblings into a formation that bore suspicious resemblance to a standard military reconnaissance pattern. She moved between them, issuing instructions with the calm authority of a born commander, adjusting positions, correcting spacing, praising execution with the specific rather than general feedback that distinguished effective leadership from mere delegation. Rowan followed his sister's directions with quiet precision, his mind clearly processing the tactical framework underlying the game while simultaneously cataloging the botanical species in the garden beds they moved through. Marcus and Sage operated as a two-person disruption unit, deviating from Lyra's instructions in creative ways that simultaneously frustrated and improved the overall operation. They were chaos with a purpose, and Seraphina recognized herself in their stubborn refusal to accept parameters they had not personally approved. Caspian appeared beside her, then Lysander, then Fenris. 3 men settling into positions around her with the unconscious coordination of bodies that had shared space so long the arrangement had become gravitational. "I still remember that night," Seraphina said. Her voice was thoughtful, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had earned the luxury of reflection by surviving long enough to have something worth reflecting on. Walking into the throne room in heat, terrified, certain that accepting the mate bond meant losing everything I had built, every plan I had made, every version of myself I had fought to become. She turned to face them. 3 men who had aged 10 years in her company, whose faces she knew better than her own, whose scars she had memorized with her fingers in the dark, whose fears she carried alongside her own because the bonds made solitary suffering impossible. And she had learned, slowly and against every instinct her survival had trained into her, that shared weight was lighter weight. "I thought you would diminish me," she said. "I thought becoming yours meant becoming less." She touched the silver pendant at her throat, her mother's chain, worn smooth by a decade of daily contact, the metal warm from her skin. "I was wrong. You did not take anything. You gave me everything. A purpose larger than survival. Authority to create actual change. A family that expanded beyond anything I dared to imagine when I was 13 years old, standing in a field of ash." Caspian reached for her, drew her against his chest with the unhurried confidence of a man who had held her 10,000 times and intended to hold her 10,000 more. "We did not save you." He spoke the words against her hair. "We found you. There is a difference. You were already everything you needed to be. We just gave you the platform to show the world what we already saw." His hand settled over the pendant at her throat. "And you have spent every day since proving the goddess knew exactly what she was doing when she bound us together." Lysander's arms joined Caspian's, then Fenris. 3 men surrounding her in a formation that had begun as protection and become something else entirely. Home, not a location. A configuration of bodies and bonds and shared history that could be assembled anywhere and would always mean the same thing. "No regrets?" Fenris asked. His voice was rough. The question was genuine. Even after 10 years, even after 4 children and countless crises survived and a territory transformed, he still needed to hear it, still needed confirmation that the woman he loved had chosen this life rather than been trapped in it. Seraphina looked at her mates, at her children in the garden below, where Lyra was now teaching Sage a flanking maneuver that Fenris had taught Seraphina in their 2nd week of training. At the territory beyond the fortress walls, where wolves lived safer and freer and more dignified lives because 4 people had chosen partnership over dominion. She thought of Elias and Dana and Thomas Riverbend, whose names she carried in her chest beside the mate bonds. She thought of the 15-year-old girl whose letter Lysander had read aloud in the intelligence room on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought of the Omega Education Centers and the Small Pack Advisory Council and every policy change that had originated in her understanding of what it meant to be overlooked. She thought of her father, teaching her to read maps in the dark, and her mother, whose pendant had traveled from a field of ash to the throat of a queen. "Not a single one," she said. "This is exactly where I was meant to be." And for the first time since that terrifying night 10 years ago, she meant it without reservation, without tactical calculation, without the part of her mind that had been trained to assess every statement for strategic value before allowing it past her lips. She simply meant it. Below them, Lyra looked up at the balcony, silver eyes, inherited from her father's, catching the afternoon light. The girl smiled at her mother with an expression that contained 10 years of being raised by 4 parents who had proven that strength was not dominance and love was not weakness, and the most powerful thing a leader could do was build systems that would outlast any individual. Seraphina smiled back. The story of the Omega who walked into Obsidian Fortress, expecting a 30-minute ceremony, and walked out as queen had become the kind of tale that young wolves repeated to each other in the dark. Not because it was romantic, though it was. Not because it was dramatic, though it was that too. But because it demonstrated something that every wolf who had ever felt small or overlooked or insufficient needed to believe was possible. That destiny did not always match the plan. That strength could wear any shape. That the most extraordinary transformations began not with power, but with the willingness to stand in a room full of people who doubted you and say, with absolute conviction, "I am enough." The sun moved across the sky above Obsidian Fortress. In the garden, 4 children played. On the balcony, 4 parents stood together. Across the northern territories, thousands of wolves lived lives shaped by decisions made in rooms they would never enter by people they would never meet, who had chosen, day after day, to build something worth the cost. This was leadership. This was partnership. This was what happened when 4 people chose to build together rather than rule alone. Seraphina leaned into the warmth of 3 bodies that knew her completely and loved her precisely, and had never once asked her to be less than she was. And this, she thought, was only the beginning.